Special recognition goes out to the following 68 family members of staff that have served in one of the branches of our military. David Kirkland, father of Mrs. Fawn McMacken, United States Navy. Kevin Haynes, father of Mrs. Heather Kojancic, U.S. Army Reserve. Frank Kranitz, father of Mrs. Jerry Kroll, United States Army, World War II. David C. Schatz, Sr., U.S. Army, father of Mrs. Karen Wendell. Colonel David L. Morgan II, brother of Mr. Brad Morgan, United States Marine Corps. Donald M. Buttery, father of Mrs. Candy Eckert, World War II Staff Sergeant. Jack Healy, father-in-law of Mrs. Betsy Healy, United States Navy. Robert Joseph McDivitt, father of Mrs. Michelle McDivitt, United States Army. Alex Steinbauer, cousin or grandson of Superintendent Dr. Brian Toth, United States Army, National Guard. Emo Gavazzi, father of Mr. Jeff Gavazzi, United States Navy. LaJoy Newell, father of Mrs. Margie Schlimm and my father-in-law, United States Navy. George Gankowski, father of Mr. Chris Gankowski, United States Army. Lieutenant Colonel Richard A. LeBlanc, father-in-law of Mr. Jim Workman, United States Army. Santo Dragone, father of Mrs. Melinda Posterero, United States Army. Walter Vincent Zawatsky, grandfather of Mrs. Jen DeFilippi, U.S. Army, World War II, prisoner of war. Robert W. Schmidt, grandfather of Mrs. Johanna Schlager, United States Army Air Force, World War II. James A. McGonnell, father of Mr. Jim McGonnell, U.S. Army, World War II. Ivan Workman, father of Mr. Jim Workman and the grandfather of Miss Rochelle Workman, United States Navy. Jack Haynes, grandfather of Heather Kojancic, United States Army. John Schlimm, my father and the father-in-law of Mrs. Margie Schlimm, U.S. Navy. George C. Moore, grandfather of Mrs. Joanna Swagger, U.S. Navy, World War II. Doug Butterfuss, father of Miss Danielle Butterfuss, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Carl Green, Harris Green, Tom Green, World War II veterans, uncles of Mrs. Amy Reed. David C. Schatz Jr., brother of Mrs. Karen Wendell, United States Air Force. Dave Hoy, father of Mrs. Betsy Healy, U.S. Navy. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Van Giesen, cousin of Mrs. Krista Wenzel, killed in action in Afghanistan, 2011. Barb Workman Berry, sister of Mr. Jim Workman and the aunt of Rochelle Workman, United States Air Force. Paul Cower, grandfather of Mrs. Tracy Meeker, U.S. Army. Gary Tamberlin, father-in-law of Mrs. Jennifer Tamberlin, United States Army. Michelle Labont, niece of Mrs. Jen Labont, U.S. Army National Guard. Lieutenant Colonel Julie Jacob Freeman, daughter of Mrs. Mary Jacob, United States Army. Emmanuel Legs Belegy, father of Mrs. Amy Reed, U.S. Army. James Hansloven, U.S. Army Korea, the grandfather of Mr. Jim Hansloven. George Dallison, grandfather-in-law of Mrs. Angie Catalone, U.S. Army. Glenn Capella, father of Miss Ann Wendell, United States Air Force. Mario Sura, grandfather of Mr. Dominic Sura, United States Marine Corps, World War II. J. Walter Knobloch, grandfather of Mrs. Erin Hansloven, United States Navy. Vito Farah, grandfather of Miss Casey Farah, U.S. Army, World War II. Emran Samick, grandfather of Mrs. Jen LeBont, United States Navy, World War II. Victor Posterero, United States Navy, father-in-law of Mrs. Melinda Posterero. Victor C. Alio, father of Judy DePrater, United States Army, World War II. Charlie Seidlinger, grandfather of Mrs. Heather Kojancic, United States Navy. Richard Ambrosius, Susan Ambrosius, United States Army Nursing Corps, parents of Mrs. Lena Gavazzi. John Cooney, grandfather of Mrs. Jen LeBont, United States Navy, World War II. Joseph Piccolo, husband of Mrs. Evelyn Piccolo, United States Navy, Vietnam. Charles A. Lovett, father of Mr. John Lovett, United States Marine Corps, World War II, Korea. Albert Catalone, grandfather-in-law of Mrs. Angie Catalone, United States Navy. Lieutenant Colonel William Freeman, son-in-law of Mrs. Mary Jacob, United States Army. Staff Sergeant Eric Money, cousin of Mr. Kevin Gilmore, United States Army, Iraq. Edna Green Belegy, United States Marine Corps, the mother of Mrs. Amy Reed. Carl John Emen Jr., father of Mrs. Chrissy Kuhar, United States Army. Bill Schatz, brother of Mrs. Karen Wendell, United States Marine Corps. Joseph LeBont, father-in-law of Mrs. Jen LeBont, United States Air Force, World War II. Robert Perryman, grandfather of Mrs. Molly Whaler, United States Navy, World War I. Roger Maraglia, grandfather of Mr. Jim Hansloven, U.S. Army, World War II. Mervyn Barnett, husband of Mrs. Lois Barnett, United States Army. Clayton Kennedy, uncle of Miss Casey Farah, United States Army, Vietnam. Dave Wahlberg, father of Mrs. Michelle Tripodi, United States Army, Vietnam. William Rolick, grandfather of Mrs. Michelle Tripodi, United States Army. Dwayne Liptak, cousin of Mr. Charlie Liptak, United States Marine Corps. Harry Eckenroth, grandfather of Miss Casey Farah, United States Army. Joseph Schudica, father of Mrs. Evelyn Piccolo, United States Navy, World War II. Connie Bauer, cousin of Mr. Steve Bauer, United States Air Force. John Anthony, father-in-law of Mr. Tim Henry, United States Marine Corps. Kevin Gilmore, St. Mary's Technology Director, United States Coast Guard. Chris Casey, middle school teacher and the father of Sarah Casey, United States Air Force Reserve. Christopher E. Loudon, United States Army, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, killed in action October 2006, son of Mr. Randy Loudon.